The word appears only a handful of times in the Bible, all in Paul's letters. But what it lacks in occurrences, it more than makes up for in importance. I'm talking, of course, about the idea of adoption. No, not modern-day adoption, but the adoption of us Gentiles by God through Jesus Christ. Hello, I'm Stuart Baskin, pastor of First Presbyterian Church of Tyler, Texas, and this is your daily devotional for Friday, September 9th, 2022. Paul uses the metaphor of adoption in 3 different letters, Romans, Galatians, and Ephesians. And it is a really good use of a metaphor in this case because we can instantly understand much of what it means. Much, but not all. And like all metaphors, it is not perfect, but it still works very, very well. Here's how Paul uses the metaphor in Galatians. He's been talking about how we have been under the guardianship of the law before the coming of Christ. Notice that this too is kind of a family metaphor. It implies that in a very real sense before Christ we were orphans, though Paul doesn't actually use that term. Paul says, "My point is this. Heirs, as long as they are minors, are no better than slaves, though they are owners of the property. But they remain under guardians and trustees until the date set by the father. So with us. While we were minors, we were enslaved to the elemental spirits of the world. But when the fullness of time had come, God sent his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, in order to redeem those who were under the law, so that we might receive adoption as children. And because you are children, God has sent the Spirit of his Son into our hearts, crying, 'Abba, Father.' So you are no longer a slave, but a child. And if a child, then also an heir through God." Several things need to be said about this. First, as adopted children, we are adopted into a family that already existed. It is the family of Abraham, of whom our Jewish sisters and brothers have been a part from the very beginning. As Paul makes very clear, using a different metaphor, we have been engrafted into the main body of a plant that already existed long before we Gentiles came along. In our adoption, then, we are the younger siblings in a large family of faith. Second, as adopted children, we are reminded that God first chose us before we could ever respond to God in faith. Our adoption is a free gift of God's grace, which we didn't earn and certainly do not deserve. Our position in God's family wasn't given to us because of any merit on our own, but only out of the deep, infinite well of God's loving mercy. Third, because adoption is a gift of God's grace, we have no room to brag or boast. If we ever have a right to brag, it is only for the things which we can claim credit for, and this isn't one of them. Still, it doesn't stop some people from having a sense of spiritual pride, which is a huge slap in the face to God. Instead of a sense of false pride, the better response is gratitude. Gratitude which issues into a new way of life pleasing to God. Fourth, the sign of our inheritance is that we are enabled to cry out to God as Abba, Father. And when we cry out to God in our times of distress, it is a kind of proof that we have actually received the gift of adoption. And if the sign of our adoption is our ability to cry out to God, then the seal of our adoption is our baptism into Christ. Finally, and perhaps most importantly here, it means we become heirs of the kingdom. Just as legally adopted children in our day become heirs to their adoptive family fortunes, so we as adoptive children become heirs of God's kingdom. Or as Paul puts it in Romans, we become heirs in the sense of the redemption of our bodies. It means that our inheritance consists of our eternal life in the kingdom. And that is quite an inheritance indeed. Tomorrow, who is our king? But for now, may God continue to bless you and keep you in all that you do this day and in all the days ahead.